Alright, back again, Luke here, and today I was going through some of my emails and I had gotten a lot of comments on that last video I put up about that Neo Geo repair. Some people were wondering how to do trace repair and how to do soldering in general, so I thought I'd just make a video here to try and show you guys some of the different parts about soldering and maybe how to replace a trace or how to fix a broken trace on one of your gaming systems or arcade boards or anything that you have at home, broken electronics that you want to get repaired. Now this isn't scripted at all, so there might be some parts where I jump in and out of. I might get off track a little bit, so just try and bear with me here. This is kind of a little bit of a quick video, but I thought I could make something just to help you guys out a little bit. First off here, as you can see in front of me, there are some different tools that I have laid out. I have this old arcade board here, which I'll be using to demonstrate stuff on. And to come around here to the left side, first thing you're going to want to get is you want to get a soldering pen. This one here is really abused. It gets a lot of usage. I've had a lot of comments on, Luke, you should get a new tip for it. Unfortunately, in Japan here, they don't sell tips separately because of the cheapness of these soldering pens. So what you have to do is go out and buy a new soldering pen every time the tip breaks or the tip goes bad. So what I like to do is to kind of give myself a little bit extra time on these tips is I use a file, and when the soldering pen is cooled or not plugged in, I use a file and I go around it and I file it down and try and get it back into shape, and I use that. So sometimes using a file is not a bad idea. I have a couple of screwdrivers over here. Flathead screwdrivers, usually use these to hold wires down or hold them in place while I'm soldering. This here is liquid flux. Now there's a couple of different kinds of flux you can get. There's liquid and paste, but unfortunately Japan has stopped selling the paste, so I basically have to go with liquid, which isn't too bad. We'll show some of that here in a second. On the other side here, I have a pair of needle nose pliers. I also like to use a really fine tip, kind of glasses repair screwdriver, flathead screwdriver. I have a hot glue gun here, a pair of side cutters, and some solder. There's a couple of different kinds of solder as well. There's rosin core and there's acid core. Now when you're dealing with small electronics, what you want to do is pick up rosin core or small electronic solder. You can usually find it at most of your electronics stores. For example, Radio Shack, or you can probably find it at hardware stores as well. But you want to pick up some of that. There are some different things that I don't have here. For example, desoldering flux or desoldering wick, which is used to remove solder from the board or to remove solder from any kind of points where you don't want it. It's basically copper braid, kind of looks like regular wire here, and what you do is you hold it down and you hold it on the place where you want to remove the solder, apply the soldering pen, and it kind of seeps into the wick or the braid, and then you can pull that off and you can remove the excess solder that you don't need. But what I use here is this is a solder sucker, and I know that sounds kind of strange, but what this does here is it does the same as desoldering wick or desoldering braid, and it removes the solder from the part where you don't want it to be, or if you have too much solder on the board, it'll remove the excess solder. And the way this works here is it's on a suction and it's spring loaded. And what you do is where the solder is, once you get it heated up, if you have too much solder on there, you apply this next to the desoldered area, and while the solder is still hot, you press this button here and it sucks up the solder into the inside of this pen. And then once you get enough solder in there, as you can see there's some remnants in there, you can just take it apart and kind of knock out all the excess solder and put it back together as so, and reuse it again. But what I'll do today is kind of show you how to do some soldering here and how to maybe fix a broken trace. With this board, probably a good example here, the best example or the easiest one I could probably show you, be this line here. Now this might be kind of hard to see. I don't know if the camera's going to focus or not. But as you can see here, this line is called a trace. And there are many different traces on a board, on any kind of circuit board. And what the traces do is they connect two different points or multiple different points together by thin wires. And sometimes traces are really small and sometimes clumped together like this. This is really difficult to see, but this is about 20 traces all together. Through the camera it might just look like one. But what happens from time to time is exposure to bad weather conditions, like being in storage or being exposed outside to any sort of wetness, and then over time corrosion. These traces will sometimes be eaten away. What will also happen is if you apply power, if there's a power surge, too much power, something happens in that department, what you might have is a burnout trace as well, where it will just burn the trace completely. But what you want to do is, once you've found a broken trace, sometimes it can be really difficult to find. Sometimes you may need to use a magnifying glass because of the small thinness of these traces. But once you do find a broken trace, what I like to do first is I like to use a very thin flathead screwdriver, and I like to scrape away at the top here. I don't know if you'll be able to see this so well or not, but these traces generally have a protective coating over them. Because these traces are made from copper, if you leave it exposed to any kind of elements, the copper will eventually corrode. So if you look at these boards, usually they have this green look to them, and that's usually the protective coating over the top. But what I do is scrape away some of this protective coating. And you don't want to really wrench down on this. If you start pressing down really hard and trying to scrape away at it, what you'll do is just gouge it out, and you'll actually break a trace. Some people will say that using a screwdriver or something like this is actually a bad thing, but I've never had any problems with it. So as long as it's kind of sharp and I'm not making any sort of like huge gouge marks or anything, going over it very lightly, you can wind up scraping away the protective coating and exposing the broken area. Now let's say here there is a broken trace. You found the broken trace here, and you want to try and connect 2 points. If it's a very thin break in this trace, I don't know if you'll be able to see this or not. If it's a very small break, like let's say just about the width of this tip here. In some cases what you can do is you can actually bridge it just by using solder. If it's a bigger break, sometimes even using solder you can't, you won't be able to bridge it. So what you'll have to do is you'll have to make a trace for it. When you go to apply solder to these copper wires, or these copper traces, what you'll find sometimes is the solder will stick sometimes, and sometimes it won't. For the times when the solder won't stick, that's where the flux comes in. Now, what the flux is basically like is, think about a plastic bumper on a car, and think about spray painting the front of that with just regular canned paint. It may look good for the first, few minutes, but after it dries, what it'll do is it'll just flake right off. And the same thing with these traces, the same thing with connecting wires, is if you don't use flux, it's basically like spray painting over plastic. Sometimes the flux will, or the solder will stick, sometimes the solder won't stick. It's kind of a risk. It's like a 50-50 thing. What the flux does is it acts almost like sandpaper. So think about that same bumper again. You apply sandpaper to it, and then you apply the paint to it. You have a much better, much stronger bond, and that's what the flux does, is it creates a bond here. Now, with flux, you have to be very careful with it, because although it's a really useful tool, and although it does work really well on these areas, if you use too much of it, and you use your soldering pen on too much of it for too long of a time, what you'll get is something like this. And if you can see the tip here, this tip actually used to be super sharp. It used to be a very fine tipped soldering pen. But by using this to heat up flux and heat up areas around flux, the flux is actually eaten away at the tip. Now, it's because of the heat, it gets way too hot, and it exceeds the temperature for the tip. And what the tip does is it just basically melts. And just gets past its, its state where it stays solid, and it just starts to melt. So don't apply the pen too long. Don't apply it to a huge drop of flux. Just make sure that you have a little bit of a drop, and you apply it at like maybe 10-second intervals or 5-second intervals. Just don't keep it held there, because what it'll do is something like this. But let's go back here again, and I'll show you a couple of different things as well. Let's kind of move this away from the board before we get into the soldering section here. Here are a couple of different kinds of wire. Now, if you'll notice, there are two different colors here, and we have a very easy to solder to wire, and sometimes a little bit difficult to solder to wire. Now, usually with copper wires, you can solder very easily. The solder will generally stick to this no problem, unless it has a plastic coating. Now, like some of these wires here, they either have a plastic coating or they're made out of a different metal besides copper, and sometimes the solder itself will not stick to these wires. So this is another good reason to have some flux, is the flux will help you to stick really well to these kinds of wires. To give you an example here, let's get our soldering pen. And I'm just going to move this out of the way here just a little bit. And what we'll do is we'll take our solder and we'll stick it near the wire here, and we'll stick the tip of the soldering pen next to the solder itself, and you'll see it's creating a ball here, but in this case the ball, the solder itself is not sticking. It's just balling up on the top here. Now what we're going to do is take some of that flux, and we're going to put a little bit of flux over the top of this wire. And we're still going to leave that ball of solder there as well. But watch what happens with this. See if we can get it to stick down there. You can see it. It almost flows like a river once it gets hot. And this thing probably isn't going to focus very well. But that same ball of solder that we had sitting on there actually has coated the wires now very nicely. So this flux creates a really strong bond between the solder itself and the area that you're going to apply it to. And without it, sometimes it can be really bad, especially with different kinds of wires. Like I said, this one is copper, and normally with copper wires it's okay. It should work really well, but sometimes if it's plastic coated copper wires, or if the copper wires are a little bit discolored, sometimes it won't stick so well, so that's where the flux comes in. Basically, when we go back here to our trace, our broken trace, what we're going to do is we'll do the same thing. If the trace has got a small gash in it, a very small gash, like I said, it's probably something that can be just bridged easily. But what we're going to do here is we'll put a little bit of flux down here and try and heat this up. And you can see the color change. There's still a little bit of solder on the end of this tip. I know it's really hard to tell because the tip is in really bad shape, but there is some solder still at the end of this tip, and just by running this along that exposed area, you can actually see the color changing, and that is the flux itself is taking the solder from the tip of the soldering pen, and it's basically drawing it into the exposed area. Now, if you have a lot of solder on the end of your pen, there's something else that you can get, which is a solder tip cleaner, which basically looks just like a sponge to an extent, but it's not a sponge. You put your soldering tip in there and it'll pull the excess solder off of it, so you don't have to worry about touching other areas with it. Unfortunately, I don't have one of those. Another thing that some people do is they just kind of sling the solder, and if you have an area where you don't really worry about solder being flung, or you don't have anything important around there, anything that's that you don't mind burning, like a spare piece of wood, if you just you know, kind of flick the pen itself, the solder will sometimes generally go flying off the pen and kind of expose the tip. And not one of the best ways to do it, but it's one way that some people go about doing that. So, trying to repair this trace here. I've gone over it a little bit, but I can still see a bit of a break in here. And the camera is probably not going to pick that up, but that's okay. You're going to have to trust me on that. What I do to replace a trace, or repair a broken trace, is if you take a look at our wire here again, you can see that I bent off one small piece. Now what I'm going to do with this piece here is I'm actually going to cut it, and I'm going to solder that down there. And like I said, these are basically hairline traces, so one piece of wire, one bare piece of wire, is about the same width as one of these traces. So once again, I'm going to try and dip this into my flux. Normally I wouldn't be doing this over the circuit board at all. I'd be doing this away from the circuit board because you don't want it to stick or fall or have any sort of liquid on the circuit board. You want to have it as clean as possible. So, but just for demonstration purposes, I've applied some of that flux again, and I'll just try and go over this one more time. See if we can change the color just a little bit. And that's kind of tinned up there. You can see that it's changed from the copper color here to the silver color. And now what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to take my side cutters, and I'm going to clip off the piece that I need. Now, in some cases you may need a very, very, very small piece. So what I'm going to do is, in this case here, all I have is just my two fingers, but a pair of like needle nose pliers or a pair of tweezers will also work very well. So, as you can see here, we have one very thin wire, which I have already kind of dropped down there, but you can see there is one thin wire here, and this is going to be our trace. Very, very, very thin. In this case here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to align it with the two sides, and now that I have my wire tinned, I have my trace tinned, and tinning just means basically putting solder on it and having a little bit of solder on there. What I'm going to do is use my screwdriver here, and maybe I'll use just a little bit more flux, just one more drop. I'm going to use my screwdriver here, my flathead screwdriver. I'm going to hold that in place and apply just a drop there of flux. And while I'm soldering, I'm going to hold the that very thin wire down with my screwdriver, and if all goes well, what it'll do is create a bond between both sides. Just want to make sure that I have it completely aligned. Now I'm trying to do this through a camera as well, so this may not be the easiest to see. Let's see here. Get around to the other side. And this wire is a little bit bent. Alright. Now it may be kind of hard to see, but you can see this line right here, and this is the new trace that's in place. Now there's a little bit too much flux on there, so what I normally do is using a little bit of tissue or Kleenex. You can kind of blot that area off and kind of remove some of that excess solder there. But in theory, or in actuality, when you do this and you have everything connected together, and you have your flux, you have your solder, you have your screwdrivers, where you can hold everything in place while you do this, you can wind up fixing some of these traces here, and you can be back to gaming in no time flat. Like I said, this video here, it's kind of a little bit of a crashed, not well scripted video at all, but just wanted to show you guys how to do a little bit of soldering, how to fix some of these broken traces, how to make sure that or what tools you need in order to get some of these repairs done. But yeah, hopefully that helps you guys out a little bit. I wish I could have made this a little bit better here, but yeah, if you can understand some of the basics here, that's good enough. But that's about all for me for right now. Like always, I'll put up another video here soon, so thanks for watching.